The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Captain Marcus Ghost Rodriguez received the call that would change everything. His satellite phone buzzed at 0430 hours, piercing through the silence of his temporary quarters at the forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. The voice on the other end belonged to Admiral Sarah Mitchell, and her tone carried the weight of urgency that only came with life-or-death missions. "Ghost, we have a situation," Admiral Mitchell said without preamble. "American journalist Sarah Chen has been captured by Taliban fighters in the Kunar province. Intelligence suggests she's being held in a compound approximately 15 kilometers from your current position." Captain Rodriguez sat up immediately, his mind already switching into operational mode. Sarah Chen was no ordinary journalist. She had been embedded with various military units for the past 3 years, documenting the war's impact on both soldiers and civilians. Her fearless reporting had earned her respect among the troops and recognition back home. More importantly, she possessed sensitive information about ongoing operations that could compromise multiple missions if it fell into the wrong hands. "What's the timeline, Admiral?" Rodriguez asked, reaching for his gear. 48 hours maximum. Our sources indicate they plan to move her to a more secure location after that. Once she disappears into the mountain caves, we may never get another chance. Rodriguez assembled his 6-man SEAL team within the hour. Each member had served multiple tours and earned their place through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication. There was James Hawk Thompson, the team's sniper whose steady hands had saved countless lives. Miguel Tank Santos served as their demolitions expert, capable of creating or destroying obstacles with surgical precision. David Doc Williams was their medic, a man who could perform life-saving surgery under enemy fire. Kevin Wire Johnson handled communications and electronic warfare, while Anthony Breacher Clark specialized in close-quarters combat and door breaching. The intelligence briefing revealed a complex situation. The compound where Chen was being held sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley frequently used by insurgent supply routes. The structure itself was a traditional Afghan compound with high mud brick walls, multiple buildings, and several escape routes leading into the surrounding mountains. Satellite imagery showed at least 12 armed guards, with the possibility of more inside the buildings. "The layout favors the defenders," Rodriguez explained to his team as they studied the aerial photographs. "High ground, multiple firing positions, and limited approach routes. We'll need to move fast and silent." Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the base commander, joined the briefing to provide additional context. "The local tribal leaders are neutral at best, hostile at worst. You won't have friendly support once you leave our perimeter. Extraction will be challenging, especially if things go sideways." Rodriguez nodded grimly. Every SEAL mission carried risks, but this one presented unique challenges. The terrain was unforgiving, the enemy was well positioned, and they had an innocent civilian to protect during the firefight that would inevitably follow their assault. The team spent the next 6 hours in intensive preparation. They studied every detail of the compound, memorized guard rotations observed through drone surveillance, and planned multiple contingency scenarios. Each SEAL knew his role and the roles of his teammates. Communication would be crucial, as would split-second timing. "Remember, Chen is our primary objective," Rodriguez emphasized during their final briefing. "Everything else is secondary. We get in, we get her, and we get out. No heroics, no unnecessary risks." As darkness fell, the team conducted final equipment checks. Night vision goggles, suppressed weapons, explosive charges, medical supplies, and communication gear were inspected and double-checked. Each man carried enough ammunition for a sustained firefight, along with emergency rations and water for the 24-hour mission window. The helicopter insertion would take place 8 kilometers from the target compound. From there, they would move on foot through rugged terrain, avoiding known patrol routes and observation posts. The approach would require 4 hours of careful movement through enemy territory, timing their arrival to coincide with the guard's shift change at 0200 hours. Rodriguez felt the familiar pre-mission tension building in his chest. After 12 years of special operations, he had learned to trust his instincts. Something about this mission felt different, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The intelligence seemed solid, the plan was sound, and his team was among the best in the Navy. Yet a nagging sense of unease followed him as they boarded the MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. The flight to the insertion point passed in relative silence. Each SEAL was lost in his own thoughts, running through the mission parameters one final time. The helicopter's crew chief gave them a 5-minute warning, and Rodriguez felt his heart rate increase slightly. This was the moment when planning ended and execution began. As they approached the landing zone, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. 30 seconds to touchdown. Weather looks good. No visible enemy activity in the immediate area. Rodriguez checked his watch. 2,147 hours. They were right on schedule. In approximately 6 hours, they would either be heading home with Sarah Chen safely in their custody, or they would be fighting for their lives in a foreign land. The captain had no way of knowing that in less than 8 hours, he would face a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and that a single shot would indeed change everything. The Black Hawk helicopter touched down with barely a whisper in the rocky valley, its rotors cutting through the thin mountain air. Rodriguez and his team moved with practiced efficiency, sliding down the ropes and establishing a defensive perimeter within seconds. The helicopter lifted off immediately, disappearing into the darkness and leaving the 6 SEALs alone in Taliban territory. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving. Jagged rocks and deep ravines created a maze of shadows and potential ambush points. The altitude made breathing more difficult, and the temperature had dropped significantly since their departure from base. Rodriguez checked his GPS coordinates and confirmed their position, then signaled his team to begin movement toward the target compound. They moved in a tactical formation that had been perfected through countless training exercises and real-world operations. Hawk Thompson took point, his sniper rifle equipped with night vision scope scanning for threats. Rodriguez followed 20 meters behind, with Doc Williams and Tank Santos flanking the formation. Wire Johnson maintained communication watch, while Breacher Clark secured their rear approach. The first 2 hours of movement proceeded according to plan. They navigated through rocky terrain that provided natural concealment, while avoiding the main trails that insurgents frequently used for supply runs. The team communicated through subtle hand signals and occasional whispered reports through their encrypted radio system. "Ghost, this is Hawk." Thompson's voice came through Rodriguez's earpiece. "I've got movement ahead, approximately 300 meters. Looks like a 2-man patrol moving east along the ridgeline." Rodriguez called a halt and motioned his team into concealment among the large boulders that dotted the mountainside. Through his night vision goggles, he could see the patrol Thompson had spotted. 2 armed men were moving casually along a well-worn path, their AK-47 rifles slung across their shoulders. They appeared to be conducting a routine security sweep, rather than actively hunting for intruders. The SEALs remained motionless for 15 minutes until the patrol passed beyond visual range. Rodriguez noted the timing and direction, adding this information to his mental map of enemy activity patterns. Intelligence briefings were helpful, but real-time observation of enemy movements was invaluable for mission success. "Patrol is clear," Hawk reported. Resuming movement. The team continued their approach, adjusting their route slightly to avoid the patrol path they had just observed. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed higher into the mountains. Loose rocks threatened to create noise with every step, requiring extreme caution and slower movement than Rodriguez would have preferred. Wire Johnson's voice broke the silence as they reached a ridgeline that provided their first clear view of the target compound. "Ghost, I'm picking up radio chatter from the objective. Sounds like normal guard communications. Nothing that suggests they know we're coming." Rodriguez moved forward to join Thompson at the observation point. The compound lay spread out below them, exactly as depicted in the satellite imagery. High walls surrounded a central courtyard with 3 main buildings. Guard towers occupied 2 corners of the compound, and Rodriguez could see the silhouettes of armed sentries moving between positions. "Count 12 visible guards, just as intelligence predicted," Thompson whispered. "Guard rotation appears to be every 2 hours. I can see movement in the eastern building where Chen is supposedly being held." Doc Williams crawled up beside them and pointed toward the main gate. "Look at that approach. No cover for the last 100 meters. If we go through the front, we'll be sitting ducks the moment they spot us." Rodriguez studied the compound through his binoculars, analyzing potential entry points and escape routes. The intelligence had been accurate about the layout, but seeing it firsthand revealed additional challenges. The compound's position on elevated ground provided excellent defensive advantages for the Taliban, while limiting options for an attacking force. "Tank," What do you think about the eastern wall? Rodriguez asked his demolitions expert. Santos had been examining the structure through his own night vision equipment. That wall looks older than the others, probably the original construction. I could breach it, but the explosion will definitely announce our presence. Once we blow that wall, we'll have maybe 2 minutes before every fighter in the valley knows we're here. Breacher Clark offered an alternative perspective. There's a drainage culvert that runs under the northern wall. It might be large enough for one person to crawl through, possibly two if we're lucky. Could be our way in without alerting the guards. Rodriguez weighed their options carefully. An explosive breach would be fast but noisy, guaranteeing a fierce firefight during their escape. The drainage culvert offered stealth but would require more time, and leave them vulnerable if discovered during the infiltration process. Wire, any electronic countermeasures we need to worry about? Rodriguez asked. Johnson had been monitoring radio frequencies and scanning for electronic signatures. They've got basic radio communications, but nothing sophisticated. No motion sensors, no electronic perimeter security. These guys are relying on traditional guard posts and patrols. The team spent another hour observing the compound, noting guard movements and identifying the building where Chen was most likely being held. Thompson had spotted what appeared to be a person in the eastern building's second-floor window, though positive identification was impossible from their current distance. As 30 hours approached, Rodriguez made his decision. They would use the drainage culvert for initial entry, with Tank Santos standing by to create an explosive exit route if their stealth approach was compromised. The timing would be crucial. They needed to reach Chen and begin their extraction before the Aero 200 guard rotation discovered their presence. Remember, once we're inside, noise discipline is critical, Rodriguez reminded his team. Suppressed weapons only until we absolutely have no choice. Doc, you stay with Chen once we find her. Tank, be ready to blow us an exit if things get complicated. The team began their final approach to the compound, moving carefully through the remaining terrain that separated them from their objective. Each SEAL understood that the next phase of their mission would determine whether they returned home as heroes or became another casualty statistic in America's longest war. As they reached the outer perimeter of the compound, Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. Years of training and experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him that this mission was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The drainage culvert lay just 30 meters ahead, but those 30 meters felt like the longest distance he had ever traveled. The drainage culvert proved to be both a blessing and a curse. While it provided the concealed entry point Rodriguez had hoped for, the narrow concrete tunnel was partially blocked with debris and standing water that soaked through their uniforms within minutes. Tank Santos led the way, carefully pushing aside rocks and accumulated sediment while trying to minimize noise. Ghost, this thing gets tighter about halfway through, Santos whispered back through the tunnel. I can make it, but anyone bigger than me might have trouble. Rodriguez grimaced as he followed Santos through the cramped space. Breacher Clark, the largest member of their team, would have significant difficulty navigating the tunnel. They had committed to this approach, however, and turning back now would cost precious time they couldn't afford to lose. One by one, the team squeezed through the drainage tunnel and emerged inside the compound's northern wall. They found themselves in a storage area filled with farming equipment and supplies, providing temporary concealment while they oriented themselves to their new environment. The smell of animals and hay filled the air, mixing with the distinctive odor of diesel fuel and gunpowder. Wire Johnson immediately began scanning for electronic signals, while Doc Williams checked their equipment for water damage from the tunnel crossing. Thompson moved to a window and began observing guard positions from their new vantage point inside the compound walls. Guards are maintaining their positions as expected, Thompson reported quietly. But I'm seeing additional movement in the main building. Looks like someone's awake who shouldn't be. Rodriguez joined Thompson at the observation point and felt his stomach drop. Through the window of the main building, he could see figures moving around with more purpose than typical late-night activity would suggest. Either the Taliban were conducting some kind of meeting, or worse, they had somehow detected the SEAL team's approach. Wire, you picking up increased radio chatter? Rodriguez asked. Johnson adjusted his equipment and listened carefully to the intercepted communications. Negative on radio traffic, but that doesn't mean much. They could be using runners or pre-planned signals that we wouldn't detect. The team's carefully planned timeline was already beginning to slip. They had expected to locate and extract Chen within 30 minutes of entering the compound. Instead, they found themselves dealing with unexpected complications that threatened to extend their exposure time significantly. Santos moved toward the door that led from their storage area into the main compound. "Ghost, we need to move. Every minute we spend here increases our chances of detection." Rodriguez made a tactical decision that would haunt him later. Rather than abort the mission and call for extraction, he decided to continue with their original plan despite the growing signs that something was wrong. The thought of leaving Sarah Chen in Taliban custody for even one more day outweighed his concerns about the developing situation. "We proceed as planned," Rodriguez decided. "Thompson, you and Johnson establish overwatch positions here. Cover our movement to the eastern building. Santos, Williams, and Clark come with me." The team split into two groups, with Thompson and Johnson remaining in the storage building to provide covering fire if needed, while Rodriguez led the assault team toward the building where intelligence suggested Chen was being held. Moving across the compound's central courtyard required extreme caution. The area was illuminated by several oil lamps hanging from posts, creating pools of light that had to be avoided. Guard towers at opposite corners of the compound provided overlapping fields of fire that could turn the courtyard into a killing field within seconds if they were detected. Halfway across the courtyard, Breacher Clark froze and held up his fist, signaling immediate danger. Rodriguez looked in the direction Clark was pointing and saw a guard emerging from the main building, walking directly toward their position. The man appeared to be conducting an unscheduled security check, possibly investigating the noise they had made during their tunnel entry. The four SEALs dropped flat against the compound's dirt floor, hoping the irregular shadows cast by various equipment and structures would conceal their presence. Rodriguez felt his heart pounding as the guard approached to within 15 feet of their position, stopped, and began looking around suspiciously. The guard lit a cigarette and stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes. He appeared to be listening for unusual sounds or looking for anything out of place. Rodriguez gripped his suppressed pistol and prepared to eliminate the threat if the guard discovered their position. Finally, the guard finished his cigarette, dropped it to the ground, and walked back toward the main building. Rodriguez waited another 5 minutes before signaling his team to continue their movement toward the eastern building. When they reached the target building, Doc Williams examined the door and discovered their next problem. Instead of the simple wooden door depicted in their intelligence photos, they found a heavy metal door secured with both a deadbolt lock and a chain. Breaking through would require either explosive charges or significant time with lock-picking tools. This door wasn't in the briefing materials, Williams whispered. Either they upgraded security recently or our intelligence was incomplete. Santos examined the metal door and shook his head. "I can blow it, but the explosion will wake up everyone within a mile radius. Once I set this charge, we'll have maybe 90 seconds before every fighter in the compound is shooting at us." Rodriguez found himself facing a decision that went against every instinct developed through years of special operations training. The mission was becoming increasingly complicated, their timeline was slipping, and they were discovering that their intelligence had been incomplete or outdated. Standard procedure called for aborting the mission and calling for extraction. Yet somewhere behind that metal door, an American journalist was being held captive by enemies who would not hesitate to execute her if they felt threatened. Rodriguez thought about the intelligence Admiral Mitchell had mentioned, sensitive information that could compromise other operations and cost more American lives if it fell into enemy hands. "Do it," Rodriguez decided. "Blow the door. We get Chen and fight our way out." Santos began preparing his explosive charge while the rest of the team took defensive positions around the building entrance. Thompson's voice crackled through their communication system from his overwatch position. "Ghost, I'm seeing increased activity in the main building. Multiple armed individuals moving with purpose. I think our window is closing. Fast." Rodriguez felt the weight of command pressing down on him as he realized their carefully planned stealth mission was about to become a full-scale firefight in the middle of enemy territory. The decision to proceed had been his, and the consequences would fall on his shoulders regardless of the outcome. As Santos finished setting the explosive charge, Rodriguez made one final communication check with his team. In less than 60 seconds, their mission would either succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically, and there would be no middle ground. Santos's explosive charge detonated with a thunderous boom that shattered the night silence and sent the metal door flying inward in a shower of sparks and debris. Rodriguez and his team rushed through the smoking doorway, their night vision equipment automatically adjusting to the sudden change in light conditions. The interior of the building was not what they had expected. Instead of finding Sarah Chen in a makeshift prison cell, they discovered a Taliban command center complete with communication equipment, maps, and weapons storage. The explosion had killed 2 insurgents who had been sleeping near the entrance, but Rodriguez could hear voices and movement from the upper floors. "This is wrong," Doc Williams said as he surveyed the scene. "Intelligence said she was being held here, but this looks like their operational headquarters." Before Rodriguez could respond, automatic weapons fire erupted from the stairway leading to the 2nd floor. The team took cover behind overturned tables and equipment as bullets splintered wood and shattered communications gear around them. The element of surprise was completely lost, and they found themselves trapped in a confined space with an unknown number of enemy fighters above them. "Thompson, we need immediate support," Rodriguez called into his radio. "We're taking heavy fire and need covering fire for extraction." Thompson's voice came back strained with urgency. "Ghost, we've got bigger problems." "The entire compound is lighting up. I count at least 20 fighters moving toward your position, and there are vehicles approaching from the Valley Road." This was a trap. The realization hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. The intelligence about Chen's location had been deliberately leaked to draw American forces into an ambush. The Taliban had known they were coming and had prepared accordingly. Instead of rescuing a journalist, Rodriguez had led his team into a carefully orchestrated killing ground. "Santos, we need an exit route now," Rodriguez shouted over the gunfire. "Blow us a hole in the back wall." While Santos prepared another charge, Breacher Clark and Doc Williams maintained suppressing fire toward the stairway to prevent Taliban fighters from advancing to their position. The confined space worked both for and against them. The enemy couldn't flank their position easily, but they also had limited escape routes. Santos's 2nd explosion created a gaping hole in the building's rear wall, but as they prepared to move toward it, Thompson's voice crackled through their radios with devastating news. "Ghost, I have eyes on the target. Chen is in the main building, 2nd floor eastern window. But there's a problem. They've got a gun to her head and they're using her as a human shield." Rodriguez felt his world collapse. Not only had they walked into an ambush, but the person they had come to rescue was now being used as leverage against them. Through the hole Santos had blown in the wall, he could see the main building where Thompson had spotted Chen. "Can you take the shot?" Rodriguez asked Thompson. "Negative. The angle is wrong, and there's too much risk of hitting Chen. The shooter is directly behind her, using her as complete cover." The Taliban fighters in their building had stopped shooting, and Rodriguez could hear someone shouting in Pashto from the upper floor. Wire Johnson, who spoke basic Pashto, translated the message. "They're saying they want to negotiate. They know we're here for the woman, and they're offering to trade her for our surrender." Rodriguez's mind raced through their options. Surrendering meant certain death for his entire team and would accomplish nothing. Fighting their way out might be possible, but it would likely result in Chen's execution. Calling for air support or extraction would take time they didn't have, and would also probably lead to Chen's death. That's when Hawk Thompson's voice came through the radio, with a tone Rodriguez had never heard before, a mixture of desperation and grim determination. "Ghost, I might have a shot, but it's not one I ever wanted to take. There's a small window where I can see part of the shooter, but the angle means the bullet will pass very close to Chen. I'm talking about a margin of error measured in inches." Rodriguez closed his eyes for a moment, understanding the impossible position they were all in. Thompson was the best sniper he had ever worked with, capable of making shots that seemed impossible to anyone else. But even Thompson had limits, and asking him to take a shot with an innocent life hanging in the balance was asking him to risk everything on his skill. "What's your confidence level?" Rodriguez asked. 70%, Thompson replied after a long pause. "Maybe 75 if I can get a better position." Those numbers meant there was a 25 to 30% chance that Thompson's bullet would kill Sarah Chen instead of her captor. In most situations, those odds would be completely unacceptable. But with Taliban reinforcements approaching and their own ammunition running low, Rodriguez realized they might not have any other choice. The sound of vehicle engines grew louder as the Taliban reinforcements approached the compound. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from the guard towers as the remaining defenders began coordinating their fire. His team was running out of time and options. "Thompson, can you improve your position? I'm moving now, but it's going to expose me to return fire. Give me 2 minutes." Rodriguez looked at his remaining team members, Santos, Williams, and Clark, all of whom understood the gravity of their situation. They had followed him into this ambush because they trusted his leadership, and now he was facing a decision that could haunt him for the rest of his life. Thompson's voice came back through the radio, calmer now but carrying the weight of what he was about to attempt. "Ghost, I have the shot. Confidence level is now 80%. But if I miss or if something goes wrong, Chen dies. I need you to make the call." Rodriguez took a deep breath and looked through the hole in the wall toward the main building where Sarah Chen was being held. In a few seconds, he would either save her life or be responsible for her death. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to undo whatever happened next. "Take the shot," Rodriguez whispered into his radio, the words barely audible even to himself. The sound of Thompson's rifle was different from the other gunfire that had filled the night. It was a single, precise crack that seemed to cut through all other noise. Rodriguez held his breath and waited for Thompson's report, knowing that everything had just changed, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The seconds following Thompson's shot stretched into an eternity of silence that seemed to consume the entire compound. Rodriguez strained to hear Thompson's voice through the radio, desperate for confirmation of what had happened. The automatic weapons fire from the Taliban positions had momentarily ceased, as if everyone was waiting to understand the consequences of that single, precise gunshot. "Ghost? This is Hawk." Thompson's voice finally crackled through the radio, and Rodriguez could hear something in his tone that made his blood run cold. "Shot. Shot fired. Target is down. What about Chen?" Rodriguez demanded, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The pause that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime to Rodriguez and his trapped team. When Thompson finally responded, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She's alive, Ghost. Chen is alive, but she's hurt. My bullet, it grazed her shoulder before hitting the target. She's bleeding and appears to be in shock, but she's mobile." Rodriguez felt a mixture of relief and horror wash over him. Thompson had succeeded in eliminating Chen's captor, but the journalist had been wounded in the process. The 80% confidence level had fallen into the 20% margin of error, and now an innocent civilian was bleeding because of the decision Rodriguez had made. "Can you see how bad the wound is?" Rodriguez asked. "From this distance, it looks like a flesh wound on her left shoulder. She's conscious and moving, but there's definitely blood. Ghost, we need to get to her now. The other Taliban fighters in that building are regrouping." The situation in Rodriguez's building had also changed dramatically. The Taliban fighters on the upper floor had heard Thompson's shot and realized their human shield was no longer protecting them. They resumed their assault with renewed fury, pouring automatic weapons fire down the stairwell and forcing the SEAL team to take cover behind increasingly damaged furniture and equipment. "Santos, we need to move now," Rodriguez shouted over the gunfire. "Can you give us smoke cover for movement to the main building?" Santos reached for his smoke grenades while Breacher Clark and Doc Williams continued returning fire up the stairwell. "I can give you cover, but once we leave this building, we're going to be in the open with multiple shooters targeting us from elevated positions." Rodriguez made another split-second decision that would define the rest of the mission. Rather than trying to fight their way back to the extraction point, they would advance toward the main building to secure Chen, and then fight their way out together. It was a tactically unsound decision that increased their risk exponentially. But Rodriguez couldn't live with the thought of leaving Chen wounded and alone in Taliban custody. "Thompson, Johnson, can you provide covering fire for our movement to the main building?" "Affirmative," Thompson replied. "I've got a clear shot at the northern guard tower, and Johnson is suppressing the fighters in the western compound wall. You'll have maybe 30 seconds of cover fire before they adjust to our positions." Santos threw his smoke grenades through the hole in the wall, and within seconds thick gray smoke began obscuring the courtyard between their position and the main building. Rodriguez led his team through the breach, sprinting across open ground while Thompson and Johnson engaged Taliban positions around the compound perimeter. The distance to the main building was only 60 meters, but crossing that ground under fire felt like running through hell itself. Bullets whined past Rodriguez's head, kicking up dirt and stone fragments around his feet. Breacher Clark stumbled halfway across the courtyard, blood streaming from a wound on his leg. But Doc Williams grabbed him and helped him continue toward their objective. They reached the main building just as Santos's smoke grenades began to dissipate. Rodriguez could hear Chen calling for help from somewhere inside the structure, her voice weak but clearly audible above the gunfire. The team entered through a doorway that had been damaged by Thompson's sniper fire and began clearing rooms systematically. They found Sarah Chen on the second floor, sitting against a wall with her hand pressed against her wounded shoulder. Blood seeped between her fingers, but Rodriguez could see that Thompson had been right. The wound appeared to be a graze rather than a life-threatening injury. Chen's eyes were wide with shock and fear, but she was conscious and alert. "Are you Sarah Chen?" Rodriguez asked, though her press credentials hanging around her neck made the question unnecessary. "Yes," she replied, her voice shaky but determined. "Are you here to get me out of this place?" Doc Williams immediately began examining Chen's wound, while Rodriguez and the others secured the building's entrances. The bullet had indeed grazed her shoulder, creating a painful but relatively minor injury that Williams could treat in the field. "The wound is clean," Williams reported. "Bullet passed through the muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. She'll need proper medical attention, but she can move." Rodriguez helped Chen to her feet while Williams applied a pressure bandage to her shoulder. "Ms. Chen, we're going to get you out of here, but we need you to follow our instructions exactly. Can you do that?" Chen nodded, and Rodriguez could see the determination in her eyes that had made her such a respected war correspondent. Despite her injury and the trauma of captivity, she was ready to do whatever was necessary to escape. Thompson's voice crackled through the radio with urgent news. "Ghost, you need to know that Taliban reinforcements have arrived. I count 3 trucks with approximately 20 additional fighters. They're setting up positions to surround the compound. Our extraction window is closing fast." Rodriguez looked around at his team. Clark was wounded but mobile. Chen was injured but determined, and the rest of his SEALs were running low on ammunition after the prolonged firefight. The Taliban now had superior numbers and were in the process of cutting off all escape routes from the compound. "What's our ammunition status?" Rodriguez asked his team. The answers were not encouraging. Each SEAL was down to his final magazine, and they had expended most of their grenades during the building assaults. They had accomplished their primary objective of locating Chen, but now they faced the prospect of fighting their way through an increasingly large enemy force with limited resources. Rodriguez realized that the shot Thompson had taken to save Chen's life had been only the beginning of their challenges. The decision to proceed with the rescue, despite the obvious trap, had saved 1 American life, but it had also placed 6 additional lives in extreme jeopardy. As he prepared his team for what would likely be the fight of their lives, Rodriguez wondered if the rescue mission would ultimately succeed, or if that single shot had simply changed one tragedy into a much larger one. Rodriguez knew they had minutes, not hours, before the Taliban completed their encirclement of the compound. The radio crackled with Thompson's increasingly urgent reports as enemy fighters positioned themselves to cut off every possible escape route. The SEAL team's ammunition was critically low. They had 2 wounded personnel, and they were facing odds that would challenge even the most elite military unit. "Ghost, I've got an idea, but you're not going to like it." Wire Johnson's voice came through the radio from his overwatch position. "There's a ravine about 200 meters north of the compound that leads down to the valley floor. If we can reach it, we might be able to break contact and move to an alternate extraction point." Rodriguez studied the terrain through a blown-out window, trying to identify the ravine Johnson had spotted. The route would require crossing completely open ground with no cover, making them vulnerable to fire from multiple Taliban positions. It was a desperate plan with a low probability of success, but it was better than remaining trapped in the compound until they ran out of ammunition. "What about air support?" Rodriguez asked, though he already knew the answer. "Closest fixed-wing assets are 45 minutes out," Johnson replied. "Extraction helicopters can't reach us until we clear the immediate area of enemy fire." Doc Williams had finished treating both Chen's shoulder wound and Breacher Clark's leg injury. Both were mobile, though Clark was limping significantly and Chen was obviously in pain. Williams had used most of his medical supplies, leaving the team with minimal resources to treat additional casualties. Rodriguez made the decision that would either save their lives or end them. "We move in 2 minutes. Santos, do you have enough explosive left to create a diversion?" "One shaped charge," Santos replied. "I can blow the compound's main building and hopefully draw their attention while we move toward the ravine." The plan was simple and desperate. Santos would detonate his remaining explosive in the main building, creating noise and confusion that might mask their movement toward the ravine. Thompson and Johnson would provide covering fire from their overwatch positions before displacing to meet the team at the extraction point. Rodriguez helped Chen adjust her makeshift sling while explaining what they were about to attempt. "Ms. Chen, we're going to run approximately 200 meters across open ground. Stay close to me, and if anyone falls, keep moving toward the ravine. Do not stop to help unless I specifically tell you to." Chen looked directly into Rodriguez's eyes and nodded. "Captain, I want you to know that whatever happens, you and your team risked everything to save me. I won't forget that." Santos positioned his explosive charge and began the countdown. 30 seconds to detonation. "Everyone ready?" Rodriguez performed a final check of his weapon and prepared to lead his team into what might be their final combat action. The weight of command had never felt heavier as he realized that his decisions had brought them to this moment where survival depended on luck as much as skill. 10 seconds, Santos announced. The explosion that followed was massive, sending debris and flames shooting into the night sky. As Rodriguez had hoped, the Taliban fighters throughout the compound immediately focused their attention on the source of the explosion, giving his team precious seconds to begin their desperate sprint toward the ravine. They moved as a unit through the compound's damaged walls and into the open ground beyond. Rodriguez led the way with Chen close behind him, while Doc Williams supported the limping Breacher Clark. Santos brought up the rear, watching for pursuit from the compound. Thompson and Johnson's covering fire was precise and devastating. From their elevated positions, they were able to engage Taliban fighters who tried to pursue the escaping SEAL team. But their ammunition was also running low, and Rodriguez knew they couldn't maintain their suppressing fire for much longer. The ravine appeared ahead of them, a dark slash in the mountainside that promised concealment from enemy observation. Rodriguez could hear shouts and gunfire behind them as the Taliban realized what was happening and began organizing pursuit. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet, but the combination of darkness, distance, and covering fire made accurate shooting difficult for their enemies. They reached the ravine with no additional casualties, sliding down the rocky slope into temporary safety. Thompson and Johnson joined them minutes later, having successfully displaced from their overwatch positions without being detected by the pursuing Taliban forces. "Extraction helicopter is inbound to grid reference 774923, Johnson reported. "Estimated time of arrival is 12 minutes. The team moved through the ravine toward the extraction point, supporting their wounded teammates and maintaining security against possible Taliban pursuit. Rodriguez felt the first glimmer of hope since the mission had begun, though he knew they weren't safe until they were airborne and heading back to base. The MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, its crew chief providing covering fire while the SEAL team and Sarah Chen boarded quickly. As the aircraft lifted off and banked toward their base, Rodriguez finally allowed himself to believe they had succeeded. The flight back to base passed in exhausted silence. Chen had fallen asleep despite her injuries, while the SEALs performed post-mission equipment checks and began processing what they had experienced. Doc Williams monitored both wounded personnel, ensuring their injuries remained stable during the flight. 3 hours later, as Rodriguez completed his after-action report, he reflected on the mission that had changed everything. Thompson's single shot had indeed altered the course of events, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. The decision to take that shot had saved Chen's life while wounding her in the process, leading to a desperate escape that tested every skill the SEAL team possessed. "It's over," Rodriguez whispered to himself as he finished documenting the mission details. The phrase carried multiple meanings. The mission was over, Chen's captivity was over, and something indefinable about Rodriguez's own certainty in the righteousness of their actions was also over. 6 months later, Sarah Chen published a series of articles about her capture and rescue that brought international attention to both the Taliban's tactics and the sacrifices made by American Special Operations Forces. She never mentioned being wounded during the rescue, instead focusing on the professionalism and courage of the SEAL team that had saved her life. Hawk Thompson never spoke publicly about the shot he had taken that night. The knowledge that his bullet had wounded the person he was trying to save haunted him, even though everyone agreed he had made an impossible shot under unimaginable pressure. Rodriguez recommended Thompson for a Silver Star, which he accepted quietly without any of the celebration that usually accompanied such honors. For Rodriguez, the mission became a defining moment in his understanding of leadership and the moral complexities of warfare. The decision to proceed with the rescue despite obvious dangers had saved one life while risking 6 others. The choice to authorize Thompson's shot had resulted in both success and failure simultaneously. Years later, when young officers asked Rodriguez about leadership under pressure, he would tell them about a night in Afghanistan when a single shot changed everything, and how sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that haunt you forever, regardless of their outcome. The mission had been successful by any objective measure, but success in warfare, Rodriguez learned, was often far more complicated than simple victory or defeat.